Times of rest. Though the strict Sabbath restrictions are not repeated in the New Testament, all of us should plan regular times to rest and recuperate. Here's Dr. Gene Getz to explain.
And when I read that principle, I'm immediately convicted because I probably have violated that principle in my lifetime more than any other principle in the Bible, which I must confess that sin. But notice Leviticus 23, verses 1 and 3. The Lord spoke to Moses, "Speak to the Israelites and tell them, these are my appointed times, the times of the Lord that you will proclaim as sacred assemblies. For 6 days work may be done, but on the seventh day there must be a Sabbath of complete rest, a sacred assembly." And it's very important here that the seventh day is to be a day of complete rest. And then God goes on to say, "You are not to do any work. It is a Sabbath to the Lord wherever you live." Now it's interesting that when you go into the New Testament, this is one commandment, the Sabbath day, to keep it holy, that is not repeated in the New Testament. But there's a principle here. And Jesus gets at that principle one day when he was addressing the Pharisees, who were very, very legalistic about this Old Testament law. And they had added a number of other things to that law beyond what God had even said. And so Jesus said to them, in terms of their criticism, "Have you never read what David and those who were with him did when he was in need and hungry, how he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar the high priest, ate the sacred bread," which was a no-no. But what he's simply saying is, it's not lawful for anyone to eat except the priests, and also gave them to his companions to eat. And then he told them the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. In other words, God established this law for man's benefit. So inherent in that, there is a principle. And we conclude this paragraph, "Therefore, Jesus said, the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." In other words, he's saying, I have created the Sabbath. I created it for man because I know the vulnerability of mankind, that we need rest. We need to recuperate. And so here he is saying to these religious leaders, you've taken a law, you've made it an end in itself. You don't even understand the purpose behind it. And so consequently, what we have in the New Testament is a principle that gets at a God-created need in our lives because we're human beings. And the principle really relates to the fact that we need time to rest and recuperate. Now we'll talk about how you do that without becoming legalistic. You have to understand the principle if we're not going to be legalistic. But I think it is a principle. Some of you have heard me tell the true story about a great race across the great northern tundra, way north, up in Canada, where they have dog sled races that go for weeks. For weeks. And so one individual started the race, determined that he was going to run his dogs straight through without a day of rest. The other man decided he was going to rest his dogs every seventh day. Came to the seventh day. He rested his dogs. The guy who wouldn't rest his dogs just kept right on going. Well, obviously he got way out ahead. But you know what happened by the end of the next week? This man caught up with the man who didn't rest his dogs. And he rested his dogs. The other man just kept going. The end of the story is when they reached the end of the race, the man who rested his dogs every seventh day was way out ahead of the guy that drove his dogs straight through. True story. I heard that shared in a class when I was a student at Moody Bible Institute. I've never forgotten that story. And it's a very, very important principle. Unfortunately, I haven't practiced that principle as I should over the years. I've tried to reflect on that And one of the reasons was I grew up on a farm. My dad was a farmer. He was a dairy farmer. And you milk cows 7 days a week, twice a day. Furthermore, he drove a milk route where he picked up cans of milk back when they had milk routes. He picked up these cans, took them into the plant, and he would pick up milk from other farms. So he had to work 7 days a week. He had that milk route for years. So I never saw my dad ever take a day of rest in his whole lifetime. And I'm amazed he lived as long as he did. God was gracious. But that was true of so many people who grew up in farm areas. So I didn't have a very good model. In all of his life, he died at 78, I don't ever remember Dad ever taking a vacation. Ever. Now, I wish he had. I wish I'd understood that, because it became a part of my mentality. When I passed the baton of leadership to my successor at the church, I had accumulated over 6 months of vacation time that I'd never taken. I'm not proud of that, because that does wear and tear, I think, on your body. Fortunately, I've got some good genetics from my mom, but I don't want to lean on that. So I had to do some re-evaluating in my old age. Now, I can think of 1,000 things to do every morning when I get up. Fortunately, I've loved most of what I've done all my life. And I think that's helped compensate for my sins. You know, and because if you love what you do, that is redeeming, I think. But there's always stress. And so consequently, we do need times of rest and recuperation and rebuilding. Now, the question is, in what ways can we rest and recuperate without becoming legalistic? I just heard a message on that from a fellow pastor that was just an excellent message. He had to get up and confess his sin as well. And I think as pastors, we can really become guilty of this, because it's incredible the demands that are on you. And if you don't really, discipline yourself, you can really be in a race of humanity that really there's no end. I was a professor for a number of years, and then I became a pastor. And there's a little saying, that a man works from sun to sun, and a woman's work is never done. And I've often said, a professor works from sun to sun, but a pastor's work is never done, unless you discipline yourself to take time away. And otherwise, you can burn out, because there's always more needs to meet than you can meet, humanly speaking. And so consequently, it's very important that we do have times of relaxation. And I liked what this pastor's suggestion: relax, do something that you really enjoy. This is not legalism. It doesn't mean you have to take a whole day. You can take a half a day, a couple of times a week. There are all kinds of creative ways, and it relates back to our own personality. I think ideally a full day really is helpful. I find that if I take a full day just to break away from the routine, that even though I become a little lethargic during that day, I come back stronger after that full day, and usually accomplish far more the next day than I would have if I had just kept going. So the principle, I think, does work, and each one of us has to apply this principle uniquely as it relates to our lives without becoming legalistic, because the Bible does not legislate this law under the new covenant. But there is a principle that I think we must not ignore.